On January 24, 1978, a nuclear reactor fell from the sky and landed on Canada. Not a weapon, not a meteor, a Soviet spy satellite. Canada sent the USSR an invoice. The Soviets eventually paid half of it. And what happened in between is still the only time a nation has ever collected under the world's main space liability treaty. This is the story of Cosmos 954, the 1972 Liability Convention, and a legal precedent that the whole space industry is still living with today. To understand what fell on Canada, you need to know what Cosmos 954 actually was. It belonged to a class of Soviet satellites called RORSATs, radar ocean reconnaissance satellites. Their mission was to track Western naval vessels, especially aircraft carriers, in real time during the Cold War. That kind of wide-area radar surveillance demanded enormous amounts of electrical power. Solar panels couldn't supply enough. So Soviet engineers put a nuclear fission reactor on board, fueled by enriched uranium, to generate the electricity the radar system demanded. The safety plan was straightforward on paper. At the end of its working life, the reactor section would be boosted into a higher storage orbit, far enough up to stay in space for centuries while the radioactivity slowly decayed. With Cosmos 954, that boost maneuver failed. The satellite's orbit decayed faster than expected, and by late 1977 both Soviet and American tracking systems could see it was coming down. Reentry predictions in 1978 carried error windows of thousands of kilometers. The Soviets knew. The Americans knew. The public heard nothing. Canada itself learned only shortly before reentry. On January 24, 1978, Cosmos 954 broke apart on reentry and scattered radioactive debris across a vast stretch of the Northwest Territories, centered on the Great Slave Lake region. The debris field stretched across some of the most remote, frozen wilderness on the planet, an area roughly the size of England. A nuclear reactor, in pieces, distributed across the Canadian Arctic. Canada and the United States launched a joint operation called Operation Morning Light. In brutal Arctic winter, search teams fanned out across the tundra hunting for radioactive fragments, some of them dangerously radioactive at close range. They used low-flying aircraft fitted with radiation detectors, ground teams on snowmobiles, and every piece of specialized equipment the two countries could muster. The search zone covered tens of thousands of square kilometers. The result was sobering. Only a small fraction of the reactor core was ever recovered. The rest remains out there, under the tundra, in lakes, or simply never found. Remarkably, no civilians were killed or seriously injured, largely because the debris landed over some of the emptiest terrain on Earth. But Canada was left with a massive cleanup bill and a contaminated landscape. That left Canada with a question no country had ever seriously tested before. Who do you sue when a satellite falls on your territory? As it turned out, international law had a ready-made answer, at least on paper. The 1972 Convention on International Liability for Damage Caused by Space Objects, the Liability Convention, was exactly 6 years old when Cosmos 954 fell. Both Canada and the Soviet Union had signed it. The convention drew a critical line between two different damage situations. If a space object causes damage on the surface of the Earth, the launching state bears absolute liability. Absolute means no fault required. You just have to show the damage happened. Why such a strict rule for ground damage? The logic is simple. The victim state had zero control over what fell on it. If you launch objects into orbit, you accept responsibility for whatever comes back down. For damage that happens in outer space, one satellite hitting another, for instance, the convention uses a different standard, fault-based liability. You must prove the other side was negligent. That distinction matters enormously and is still debated today. The convention also defines the launching state. It is the state that launches a space object, procures its launch, or whose territory or facility is used for the launch. In 1978, that was unambiguously the Soviet Union. So in 1979, Canada filed a formal diplomatic claim, a government-to-government legal demand, against the USSR for $6 million Canadian dollars, covering cleanup costs and the damage caused by Cosmos 954. Canada's legal argument was deliberately layered. It invoked the Liability Convention, but it also invoked general principles of international law, including the duty of states not to cause environmental harm to other states. Canada was hedging its bets. Negotiations between Canada and the Soviet Union dragged on for 2 years. The Cold War was very much alive. The USSR was not about to formally admit it had violated international law. Diplomatic conversations at that level moved slowly and carefully. In 1981, the two countries reached a settlement. The USSR agreed to pay Canada $3 million Canadian dollars. exactly half of the original claim. That number alone tells you how the negotiation went. Critically, the payment was made ex gratia, a Latin term meaning out of grace, as a goodwill gesture rather than an admission of legal obligation. The Soviets were paying without conceding they legally owed anything. That framing is legally significant. A formal admission of liability under the convention would have set a much harder precedent to walk back. The ex gratia label was diplomatic cover, a way to close the file without losing the legal argument. Why did Canada accept half? Geopolitical reality. You do not push a nuclear superpower to the wall over a compensation claim during the Cold War. Half the money, paid quietly, was very likely the best outcome Canada was ever going to get. And yet this settlement is remarkable. To this day, it remains essentially the only time a state has actually filed and collected payment under the 1972 Liability Convention. Thousands of launches since. One payment. That is the full track record. Cosmos 954 did push the international community to act in one concrete way. In 1992, the United Nations adopted the principles relevant to the use of nuclear power sources in outer space, a set of guidelines for safer design and operation of nuclear-powered satellites. These are soft law, meaning encouraged but not legally binding. Nuclear power in space is not banned. Radioisotope power systems still fly today on deep space probes where solar energy simply does not work. But the deeper legacy of Cosmos 954 is the question it left unanswered. The Liability Convention's absolute liability rule for ground damage is still good law. The problem is the machinery for enforcing it is essentially broken. There is no international court where you file a liability convention claim. There is no enforcement mechanism. It works only if the liable state agrees to sit down and negotiate. And most states, most of the time, simply do not. Right now, thousands of satellites are in low Earth orbit. Megaconstellations from commercial operators are adding hundreds of new objects every year. Every single one of them eventually comes back down. As the number of space actors grows, private companies, smaller nations, commercial launch providers, the question of who counts as the launching state gets harder to answer. If a company incorporated offshore launches on a rocket from a platform in international waters, who exactly pays? Cosmos 954 was a near miss in the most literal sense. A nuclear reactor fell on one of the world's largest countries and caused no civilian casualties, largely because it hit some of the emptiest land on Earth. Geography saved us, not the law. If that satellite had broken apart over Edmonton, over Toronto, over any major city, the pressure to rebuild the international liability system from scratch would have been overwhelming. We would be living under very different rules today. Instead, we got a half payment, an ex gratia settlement, and a set of non-binding guidelines that nudged satellite design in a safer direction. That is the honest legacy of the only liability convention claim ever paid. The law barely caught up with a 1978 satellite. The question that matters right now is whether it can catch up with today, when more satellites launch every month than existed in the entire first decade of the space age. If you think the rules need updating, and as a lawyer who works in this space, I absolutely do, the story of Cosmos 954 is exactly where that conversation has to start. Hit subscribe, drop a comment with the case you want covered next, and follow Space Docket.